This is my true story. I spent my whole life building a farm that was more than land. It was my identity, my pride, and my promise to my family. But my daughter, the one I trusted most, sold it behind my back. She called it progress. I called it betrayal. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I waited. And when the time was right, I bought her dream house, the one she bragged about, and handed her an eviction notice she never saw coming. Before I tell you how, subscribe to this channel and share where you're watching from. I was born in the same house where my father had once taught me how to plant a seed and wait for rain. The walls of that farmhouse had heard laughter, storms, and prayers. The land around it wasn't just soil, it was memory. Every furrow, every fence, every wooden gate had a story. I worked from before sunrise till long after sunset, believing that sweat was the only honest signature a man could leave on earth. I grew wheat, corn, and humility. My hands grew calloused, but my heart stayed soft, because I was building something not just for myself, but for my family. The years rolled like seasons, one harvest after another. I married young, loved deeply, and lost early. My wife used to say the farm was my second heartbeat. Even when the world changed, when machines replaced hands and neighbors sold their land for quick money, I stayed. The soil had taken my youth, but it had given me purpose. I taught my daughter to walk between rows of corn before she could spell her name. I showed her how to hold a sapling like a promise, gentle, never rushed. She was my only child, my pride, and my hope that the farm would stay alive long after I was gone. She grew up watching the same sunrises that raised me. I taught her everything: how to fix a leaking pipe, how to milk a cow, how to pray before the first rain. She laughed at how I spoke to the soil as if it could hear me. But she always listened. She said one day she would take care of me, that the land would never lose our name. I believed her, because that's what fathers do. We believe, even when we shouldn't. Years passed. The farm began to grow, slowly, stubbornly. I bought 1 acre after another whenever I could afford it. Each piece of land carried a story, a trade, a debt, a season of waiting. Sometimes I'd go to bed hungry, but the animals always ate. I fixed tractors with wire and prayer. I sold grain at low prices and still thanked God for the rain. I kept ledgers by hand, and every number in them was a reflection of my sacrifice. But I didn't complain. Hardship, I learned, builds character. It also builds silence. When my daughter became an adult, I let her take over more responsibilities: the accounts, the calls, the buyers. She was educated, sharper than I ever was, and I thought that was a blessing. I wanted her to modernize the farm, to bring new ideas. She spoke about progress, about how city people paid fortunes for organic produce. I listened and smiled, happy to see her ambition. She said she would handle the paperwork, that she'd make everything easier. And I believed her again. The first time she went to the city, she brought back a small silver bracelet and told me it was for luck. I wore it until it broke. I didn't realize that the trip had changed her. Not on the outside, but inside. She started dressing differently, speaking differently. She spoke less about soil and more about property, less about work, more about wealth. I ignored the signs because I wanted her to have more than I did. Every father wants that, even if it means losing a part of what made him whole. The farm wasn't rich, but it was alive. The cows knew my voice. The dogs followed me like shadows. Even the old fig tree near the fence had a scar from when I carved my wife's name into it decades ago. Every evening, after the sun dipped below the hills, I'd sit by the porch with a cup of tea and listen to the wind move through the wheat. It sounded like the world breathing. In those moments, I thought I had done everything right, worked hard, stayed honest, raised my child well. But peace, I've learned, doesn't last when trust starts to rot quietly underneath. The day she stopped helping with chores, I thought it was just exhaustion. The day she missed breakfast to take a business call, I thought it was ambition. The day she avoided my eyes while talking about property taxes, I thought it was stress. The truth is, betrayal never arrives loudly. It comes softly, disguised as busyness, wrapped in polite smiles. I remember one morning when I found her sitting in the field, scrolling on her phone, disconnected from everything around her. The smell of soil didn't mean anything to her anymore. The farm that had raised her had become invisible. I tried to remind her that this land was her legacy, that our name was carved into its history. She nodded, but didn't respond. I didn't know it then, but she was already building a life where my world had no place. Despite everything, I kept working. Even when my knees ached and my back refused to straighten. The seasons didn't wait for grief or fatigue. I told myself that love could heal distance, that she'd come back to her senses. After all, she was my daughter. She had my blood, my values, my name, or so I thought. My friends often said I'd done enough, that I should sell the farm and retire. But I couldn't. Selling the land would be like erasing the proof of my life. The cracks in the barn, the broken gate by the south field, they were my scars, carved in wood and dust. Every inch of that place had cost me something. Every tree had heard a prayer. You don't sell your prayers, you live in them. I had always believed that legacy meant inheritance, that you pass down what you build. But with time, I learned that legacy isn't what you give. It's what remains after someone takes everything. And in my case, even after she took the land, what remained was the strength to start again. The last winter before the betrayal was the hardest. The rains came late, the crops suffered, and my body felt older than ever. My daughter spent more time in town. She said she was arranging deals. I didn't ask what kind. I thought she was handling buyers. She was handling buyers, yes, but not for crops, for the land itself. Looking back, I think I always sensed it. The way she avoided my gaze, the way she flinched when I mentioned the deed papers. But love makes fools of wise men. It blinds you not with lies, but with hope. And I hoped until the day the truth hit me like thunder in an open field. Still, before all that pain, there were years of pride. I can't forget those. The smell of rain on dry earth, the laughter of my daughter running through muddy paths, the nights when we sat together counting stars because electricity had gone out. The way she once told me she'd build me a big house someday. For all your sacrifices, Papa. Those words stayed with me, even when everything else fell apart. The farm was never about profit. It was about purpose. I didn't keep ledgers for money. I kept them to remember effort, to measure resilience, to see proof that even small lives could build great meaning. And maybe that's why losing it hurt so deeply, because it wasn't just property that vanished. It was the living proof that my life had mattered. I had built that farm like some men build cathedrals, slowly, painfully, with hands that believed in tomorrow. My faith wasn't in walls or crops. It was in continuity, that when I was gone, someone with my name would keep sowing seeds in the same soil. I believed my daughter would be that person. But she had other dreams, dreams built on shortcuts, not soil. Sometimes when I look back, I think maybe I was too hard on her growing up. Maybe she saw the farm not as home, but as a burden. Maybe her betrayal was a kind of rebellion. But even rebellion has a price. And what she took from me that day was not just my land, it was my peace. Now, when I close my eyes, I still see that farm, the morning fog rising over the wheat, the rooster crowing before dawn, the worn wooden handle of the shovel that fit perfectly into my hand after decades. That place was my life. And when she sold it without a word, she didn't just trade soil. She sold my story. But what she didn't realize was this. You can sell a man's property, but not his principles. You can take his land, but not his patience. And when I finally decided to act, I didn't need anger. I needed memory. The same patience that once grew crops would now grow consequences. It didn't happen suddenly. It never does. Betrayal, I've learned, doesn't knock on your door wearing a mask. It starts as something small. A pause too long, a tone too sharp, a secret kept behind a smile. That's how it began with my daughter. I didn't notice it the first few times. I told myself she was just tired, that life in the city was hard, that I was reading too much into things. But over time, The warmth in her eyes began to fade, replaced by something cold and distant. The farm used to make her laugh. She'd walk through the fields barefoot as a girl, humming songs, chasing chickens, asking me endless questions about the soil and the seasons. But now, when she came home, she barely stepped outside. She complained about the smell, said the dust clung to her clothes, and spent her evenings on the phone talking to people I didn't know. The sound of her laughter, once the melody of my home, now came from behind closed doors, and it didn't sound the same anymore. She started dressing differently too. Fancy handbags, expensive shoes, things I knew my modest savings couldn't afford. When I asked, she brushed it off, saying she got them on discount or that they were gifts. I wanted to believe her. Maybe part of me did. But a father knows when something isn't right. She'd leave early for meetings and come back smelling of perfume I didn't recognize. The farm no longer fit her life. She made that clear without saying it. There was a time when she'd sit beside me at dinner, telling me about her dreams, how she wanted to build something great, how she wanted to make me proud. Those words had kept me going through the hardest winters. But now, her dreams were wrapped in money, status, and escape. She spoke about city life with a glow in her eyes that used to belong to the sunrise over our fields. I realized then that she no longer wanted to live the life I had built. She wanted to outgrow it. I remember one afternoon when she was on the phone, pacing near the porch. I couldn't hear the full conversation, but I caught fragments. Paperwork, buyers, percentage, and agreement. When I asked, she smiled and said it was about a friend's business. That word, business, had started to creep into every part of her speech. I'd hear her mention offers, deals, and market value. I didn't understand much of it, but I knew it didn't sound like farming anymore. I noticed she started taking the ledger books more often. At first, she said she wanted to help keep things organized. I was grateful. My handwriting was old and rough, and the bank processes had become more complicated. But one day, I found a few pages missing, torn out neatly. When I asked, she said they were ruined by tea spills. I nodded, pretending to accept it. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in bed thinking about those missing pages, numbers that told the story of a lifetime's work, now gone without a trace. Then came the trips. She started visiting the city more frequently. To meet investors, she said. I didn't know what kind of investors were interested in our small farm, but I didn't question her. My trust was blind. I had built this life on believing in family, and I couldn't imagine a world where that belief was foolish. When she returned from those trips, she carried new clothes and new confidence, but her eyes looked older. Something in them had hardened, as if the city had replaced her reflection with ambition. One evening, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. When I asked what she was doing, she quickly locked it and smiled. "Just checking something," she said. That was when I realized she no longer spoke to me freely. Every answer was short, every glance cautious. It was like she was hiding behind politeness. Love had turned into formality. Sometimes, when we'd sit down for dinner, she'd talk about how hard I had worked, how proud she was of me. But her tone felt rehearsed, like she was reminding me of something she didn't quite believe anymore. The warmth was gone, replaced by calculation. She looked at me like one might look at an old wall before deciding whether to paint it or tear it down. The neighbors still adored her. They said I was lucky to have a daughter who was educated and responsible. They said she would take care of me in my old age. I smiled when they said that, but inside, something twisted. I wanted to believe it, but there was a quiet dread in my chest that wouldn't go away. Then there were the phone calls late at night. She would step outside to talk, whispering under the stars. I could hear her say things like final payment, confirmation, and he doesn't know yet. The words chilled me. I told myself she was helping a friend, handling someone else's business, anything that made the doubt less sharp. But deep down, I knew those words were about me. One afternoon, I found her in the storage room, rummaging through old boxes. When I asked what she was looking for, she said she needed old receipts. She left soon after, but I noticed something. The folder containing our property deeds was missing. My heart sank. I looked everywhere, convinced I must have misplaced it. For 3 nights, I barely slept. My mind played tricks on me, whispering possibilities I refused to believe. On the 4th night, I saw her walk out of her room with the folder in her hands. I wanted to ask what she was doing, but something in me stopped. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was disbelief. The next morning, the folder was back in its place, but the papers inside were rearranged. That was the first time I felt my trust break. Not completely, but like a small crack spreading through glass. You can't see it at first, but once it starts, it never stops. Her visits to town became more frequent, and her excuses became thinner. She said she was attending meetings about future planning. When I asked what that meant, she said, "It's time we think bigger." Those words should have sounded hopeful, but they didn't. They sounded like farewell. I began noticing small things, like how she'd glance at me when I talked about ownership, or how she'd change the subject when I mentioned the old lawyer who helped me with the land registration. She was careful, almost too careful. It was as if she knew every question before I asked it. Even the neighbors started noticing the distance. "Your daughter's very busy these days," they'd say. I'd nod, pretending to be proud, hiding the ache that grew inside me every time she called me old man instead of papa. It wasn't said with love anymore, it was said with impatience. The final straw came one weekend when she invited a few people over. Strangers, dressed in suits, polite but distant. They walked around the property, asking questions about soil and fencing. She said they were consultants. I didn't argue. I served them tea and watched from the porch as they pointed at different corners of my land, taking notes. Later that night, I asked her who they were. She said, "Just people giving advice." But I knew advice didn't come with measuring tapes and calculators. It was strange how betrayal can live in your home and still smile at you every morning. She'd hug me goodbye before leaving for town, and I'd stand there watching the dust rise behind her car, wondering if I'd ever see the daughter I raised again. The girl who once cried when a calf fell sick now talked about profit margins and real estate opportunities. Somewhere between the city lights and the silence of our fields, I had lost her. And yet, I didn't confront her. Not yet. Because part of me still believed that maybe she'd realize the weight of what she was doing. That maybe she'd see what the farm meant to me, to us. But love, I've learned, doesn't make people good. It only makes pain deeper when goodness fades. So I stayed quiet. I watched, and I waited. Because sometimes silence speaks louder than accusations. And when the truth finally came, it didn't scream. It arrived softly, like the whisper of the wind that carries the scent of something burning before you see the fire. It was a quiet afternoon when the truth finally reached me, not through a letter, not through a confession, but through a whisper carried by the wind of small-town gossip. Betrayal, I've learned, doesn't announce itself. It leaks through cracks in conversation. That day, I was repairing the old wooden fence near the west field, the one that had been breaking since last monsoon. The sun was strong, the air smelled of dry hay, and everything felt painfully ordinary. Then my neighbor, Elias, stopped by. He leaned on the fence and looked at me with pity, a kind of pity I had never seen before. He hesitated before speaking. That hesitation told me everything before the words even left his mouth. He asked if I had signed off on selling the farm. I laughed at first, thinking he was joking. Sell my farm? The land that carried my family's blood and sweat? I told him it must be a misunderstanding. But his silence was too heavy. He said quietly that the new owners were already making plans. Buyers from the city, talking about converting my land into plots for development. My hammer slipped from my hand. The sound echoed through the empty field like a gunshot. For a moment, I thought I hadn't heard him correctly. I asked him again, "Who sold it?" He looked away. His silence was the answer. I walked back to the house with a weight I can't describe. Every step felt heavier than the last. Inside, the kitchen smelled of tea, my daughter's favorite kind, jasmine. She wasn't home. The table was clean, her laptop open, papers stacked neatly. Something inside me told me not to look, but my hands moved anyway. The folder that once held the property deeds was there, but thinner. When I opened it, my heart stopped. The original papers were gone. In their place were copies, stamped, dated, and signed. My name was there, but the signature wasn't mine. It was similar, almost perfect, but not mine. I remember standing there, frozen. The air left the room. The clock ticked louder than my heartbeat. I could see the faint tremble in my own hands, but I didn't cry. I didn't even speak. I just stared at those papers, the evidence of a lifetime undone by a few signatures and a single act of deceit. I walked to the window and looked at the fields outside, the same fields that had seen my childhood, my father's hands, my wife's laughter, the land I thought would carry my name even after I was gone. And now it belonged to strangers, sold without a word, without permission, without conscience. When she returned home that evening, she smiled at me as if nothing had happened. She asked how my day was, and I could barely breathe. I wanted to ask her why she did it, why she couldn't look me in the eyes and tell me the truth. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded and said nothing. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the porch with the papers spread on my lap, reading every line again and again. Each paragraph was a dagger. Every stamp was proof that my daughter had planned this, carefully, patiently. I saw how she had used my trust like a key, how she had found ways to make it all legal, to make it look as if I had agreed. The bank statements, the witness names, it was all done. She hadn't just sold the farm. She had erased my consent from the story. The next morning, I went to the town registrar's office. The clerk, an old friend, recognized me immediately. When I asked about the sale, he grew quiet. He confirmed what I already knew. The documents had been processed 2 weeks ago. My daughter had claimed I was too ill to travel and had signed on my behalf with a notarized power of attorney, one she had forged. I stood there listening, every word sinking into me like stones thrown into a well. The sound of finality echoed in my chest. The farm was gone. Legally, officially, irreversibly gone. I walked out of that office and stood in the middle of the road, not knowing where to go. People passed by, neighbors, strangers, workers, all of them moving through their ordinary day while mine had ended without a sound. When I reached home, the field seemed different. The trees looked older, the colors duller. I could still hear the sound of wind rustling through the leaves, but it no longer felt like peace. It felt like mourning. I walked to the barn, touched the old wood, ran my fingers along the fence posts. Every inch of that place was part of me. And now, it was gone. That evening, my daughter came home with shopping bags. She looked happy, glowing even. I watched her unpack expensive clothes and small decorations. She said she was buying things for her new house in town. A new house. That was when everything clicked into place. The betrayal wasn't just about the land. It was about what it bought her. My farm, my legacy, had become the down payment for her dream house. I remember sitting down, quietly, watching her from across the room. She didn't even notice the papers in my hand. I saw my reflection in the glass cabinet, a tired old man who had lost everything, not to a stranger, but to his own blood. I didn't shout. I didn't confront her. My silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was gathering strength. I realized that screaming would only make her defensive. But silence would make her wonder. Silence would build the space I needed to think. That night, after she went to sleep, I walked through the farm one last time. The moonlight fell on the fields, soft and silver. I touched the soil, pressed it between my fingers. It felt warm, alive, loyal. The land had never betrayed me. People had. I whispered goodbye, not because I was leaving, but because I was changing. Something inside me hardened. The man who once believed in unconditional love was gone. What replaced him was quieter, colder, and far more dangerous. Over the next few days, I started to plan. I went through my old records, savings accounts, insurance, investments. I realized she had missed something. Not everything was in her control. The farm was gone, But the story wasn't over. A part of me wanted to forgive her. I really did. But forgiveness, without repentance, is just surrender. And I was done surrendering. In those long nights, I thought about my father, how he taught me that a man's word was worth more than his wealth, how he once said, "Never let greed rot the roots of your family." Those words haunted me now, echoing through empty rooms and fading photographs. By the end of that week, I had made up my mind. She had taken what was mine in silence. I would reclaim what she loved in silence, too. I didn't want revenge. I wanted balance, justice, written in the same ink she had used to sign away my life. The world sees betrayal as an act, but it's also a teacher. It shows you who you are without the illusions. That week, I learned I wasn't a victim. I was still the same man who had built something from nothing once before, and I could do it again. Only this time, what I would build wasn't a farm. It was a plan. That night, as I watched the lights of her new car fade down the road, I smiled faintly. She thought she had outsmarted an old man, but what she didn't know was that every seed of betrayal she planted was about to grow into her own lesson, one that money couldn't buy and time couldn't erase. After the day I learned she had sold my farm, I did not scream. I did not confront her. I simply went quiet. People think silence means defeat. It doesn't. Sometimes silence is the space where a man measures every wound, every scar, every possibility. It's where emotion turns into purpose. That first week after the betrayal, I moved through the house like a ghost. Every morning I brewed tea, sat on the porch, and stared at the empty fields that no longer belonged to me. The grass still swayed, the birds still called, but it all looked foreign now, like I was visiting someone else's home. The pain was sharp the first few days, then it dulled into something heavier, a kind of calm that sits deep in the chest. At night, I didn't sleep much. I'd lie awake thinking about every sacrifice that had led to that farm. Every year of drought I survived, every storm I rebuilt after. I remembered her as a child, running through those same fields, her laughter blending with the sound of wind in the crops. I had given her everything, and now she had turned that gift into currency. When grief runs deep, you have two choices: let it destroy you or let it teach you. I chose the second. I decided that if she could plan in silence, then so could I. My anger wouldn't scream. It would sign papers. The next morning, I went to my small study, a room filled with old ledgers, receipts, and folders that smelled of dust and ink. I started pulling them out, one by one. The room filled with piles of memories disguised as documents. Every page was a piece of my life: tax slips, insurance renewals, loan receipts, land titles, and bank statements. She had stolen one story from me, but not all of them. I organized everything carefully. Decades of paperwork became neat stacks of evidence that I was not some frail old fool. She had used my name to erase me. I would use her oversight to remind her who I still was. Then I called an old friend, my lawyer, Mr. Rahman. He had handled the farm's paperwork years ago. When he heard my voice, he was surprised. I hadn't spoken to him in ages. I didn't tell him the whole story over the phone. I just said I needed to meet. When I visited his office, I carried a folder thicker than the Bible. He listened as I explained, his expression shifting slowly from disbelief to quiet anger. He had seen greed before, but betrayal from one's own blood always hits differently. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he said one sentence that changed everything. "We'll do this the right way." Those words gave me something I hadn't felt in weeks: control. For the first time since the betrayal, I wasn't reacting. I was planning. We began by going through every document. He found inconsistencies in the sale process, missing consent forms, irregular notary signatures, dates that didn't line up. Legally, the transaction was complete, but ethically, it was rotten. We couldn't reverse it easily, but we could use it. While he handled the legal end, I began working on the financial side. I still had accounts she didn't know about, small, quiet investments from years ago, savings built on side jobs, harvest bonuses, and an insurance payout I had never mentioned. The total wasn't huge, but it was enough. enough to do something that would hurt her in the same way she had hurt me, not physically, but emotionally, through pride. I learned she had bought her dream house in town. It was expensive, far beyond what her salary or savings could justify. Mr. Rahman's assistant confirmed my suspicion. She had used the money from the farm sale as a down payment. The rest was financed through a bank loan. The house was not fully paid for. That meant leverage. The next step was patience. I didn't rush. I waited, gathered information, and studied her choices. I learned the name of the realtor who managed her property, the exact bank that held her loan, and the company that insured it. Information, I discovered, is stronger than any weapon. During those weeks, I spoke to no one about my plan. I lived quietly, doing my daily routines like any old man. I watered the plants, cleaned the porch, and walked to the market every morning. But behind that calm routine, I was building something unstoppable. A chain of actions, each perfectly legal, each guided by reason instead of rage. I started by liquidating small investments and moving them into a holding account. I transferred ownership of what remained of my savings into a legal trust under my name. The trust's purpose was simple: to purchase property. Mr. Rahman helped set it up so that it looked like a small agricultural development company. Nothing suspicious, nothing flashy, just business. Then, quietly, we watched the property listings. It didn't take long to find what I was waiting for. Her dream house was on the market again. She had listed it under pressure, unable to keep up with mortgage payments. Pride had bought her comfort, but pride couldn't pay the bills. The timing couldn't have been better. I arranged for the trust to buy it, anonymously. Every transaction was clean, every payment on record. By the end of that month, I held the deed to the house she bragged about to her friends. But this wasn't revenge and anger. It was a lesson in consequence. The same law she had used to steal my land would now return my peace. During that process, I thought often about the word justice. People confuse it with revenge. But justice doesn't need shouting or violence. It just needs truth and patience. And I had both. While all this unfolded, she kept visiting me occasionally. She'd bring gifts, fancy food, scarves, perfumes, perhaps to ease her guilt or to convince herself that she'd done nothing wrong. I accepted them politely, smiled, and said little. Every visit was like watching a stranger wear my daughter's face. Each night after she left, I'd open the folder with the property documents for her house. I'd look at her name printed beside mine, hers in fading ink, mine in fresh. There was something poetic about that. She had sold my home to buy hers. I had now bought hers to reclaim my peace. But my plan didn't end there. Once the purchase was final, Mr. Rahman drafted a formal notice of eviction. It was standard, legal, unemotional. She would receive 30 days to vacate. No surprise, no trick, just the same courtesy she never gave me. The night before sending the notice, I sat alone in my small rented room. I thought of my wife, of what she would have said if she were still alive. She would have told me to forgive, and maybe I would have, if forgiveness had any meaning left. But forgiveness without consequence is permission, and I refused to permit cruelty to repeat itself. Still, I felt no hate, only a heavy sadness that had become part of my bones, the kind that doesn't burn anymore, but stays cold and steady. On the day the notice was delivered, I didn't go to see her. I didn't need to. I imagined her opening the envelope, reading the words, and realizing that the same law she had twisted had now turned against her, quietly, cleanly, completely. For the first time in months, I slept peacefully that night. Not because I had won, but because I had acted without losing myself. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't cursed. I had simply corrected the balance of things. The next morning, I visited the temple before sunrise. The priest asked if I wanted to pray for strength. I told him, "No, I've already found it." Because sometimes strength doesn't roar. It signs papers, waits, and lets time do the rest. Days passed, and I received confirmation that she had vacated the property. I didn't see her. I didn't need to. What mattered was that justice had returned quietly, without spectacle. From that moment on, I understood something that years of hardship had never taught me. The loudest revenge is the one delivered in silence. Sometimes life gives back the very tools that were used to hurt you. It doesn't do it through miracles or luck. It does it through patience, timing, and silence. That is what I learned in the weeks after I lost my farm. I had been stripped of land, of trust, of a part of my name, but not of my mind. When I stopped reacting, the world around me began to reveal its secrets. People talk too much when they think you're harmless. Neighbors, bankers, shopkeepers, everyone had a piece of information, small and ordinary, but together they formed a pattern. I began to notice the way my daughter's name was suddenly being spoken in conversations about property, about money, about the new house in town. At first, I didn't want to believe it. I thought she was simply trying to start over. But as the details surfaced, I realized it wasn't just a house. It was her pride, her proof that she had moved beyond the farm, beyond me. The same week she finalized the sale of my land, she purchased a house on the hill, in a quiet part of town that overlooked the river. People called it the Dream District. Every window shone with ambition. Every garden was a photograph waiting to happen. It was where the successful went to pretend they had found peace. I heard about it from Elias again, the same neighbor who had told me about the farm. He said she'd been visiting the property often, meeting agents, signing documents, smiling in a way she hadn't in years. "She seems proud," he said softly. I nodded, but pride was not what I saw. I saw blindness. Pride without conscience is always the beginning of downfall. For several days, I thought about that house, not with anger, but with curiosity. What did she see in it that the farm never gave her? Comfort? Prestige? Or the satisfaction of proving she was better than the soil that raised her? I started walking by the area now and then. From the outside, the house looked perfect. New paint, tall gates, a little fountain at the entrance, all the things city people call beauty. But as I stood across the street, watching quietly, I saw something else. The house looked empty. Its beauty was all surface. There was no warmth, no laughter, no smell of cooking from inside. Just silence dressed as luxury. One day, I saw her step out with a realtor, both of them laughing, signing papers, shaking hands. She looked happy, radiant even. But that happiness wasn't peace, it was victory, and victory earned through deceit always fades fastest. Later that week, I visited my lawyer again. He had been tracking the progress of her mortgage. The documents told a very different story. She had bought the house with a large down payment, the money from my farm, and taken out a heavy loan for the rest. It wasn't sustainable. Her expenses had grown faster than her income. Within months, she would be drowning in debt. That was when I realized something simple yet profound. Greed creates its own trap. You don't need to punish a greedy person. You just need to stand back and let their own weight pull them down. But I wasn't interested in watching her fall. I was interested in teaching her to understand what she had done. The opportunity came when I overheard her speaking with a banker on the phone. I was in the next room, pretending to read the newspaper. Her voice was low but tense. Words like delayed payment, penalty, and refinancing slipped through the air. My suspicion was confirmed. She was struggling to manage her new dream. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying everything. The years of work, the fields, the betrayal. But this time, there was something different in my heart. No rage, no sorrow, just clarity. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I took the bus to town. I didn't go to her new house. I went to the local bank instead. The same bank that handled the sale of my farm. I sat across from a young banker who didn't know my story. I introduced myself as a potential investor interested in buying property in the area, particularly those under mortgage. He was polite, professional, and eager to help. I asked about recent listings, and one of the files he handed me was for a property on Riverside Lane, my daughter's address. He mentioned it casually, saying the owner had missed a payment or two but was expected to recover soon. I nodded, pretending to be mildly interested. Inside, my heartbeat slowed. steady as a drum. This was it, the moment the universe offered me the very weapon forged by my pain. Over the following weeks, I began laying the groundwork. I didn't rush. I didn't gloat. I let the situation ripen. She kept trying to maintain her lifestyle. Dinners, parties, expensive clothes. I knew those things wouldn't last long. Pride always eats faster than income. I watched her world from afar, not as a father anymore, but as a silent witness. She had made choices. Now I would make mine. I started transferring money into the trust Mr. Rahman had created. The trust became a quiet storm, building strength beneath the surface. Every deposit was a reminder that my dignity wasn't gone. It was just preparing to return. Then one day, fate handed me the final piece. I was sitting outside the cafe near the courthouse when I overheard two men discussing properties being auctioned due to loan defaults. Among the names listed, one stood out, her address again. I stayed still, sipping my tea, pretending not to care. But inside, something deep and still moved. That evening, I confirmed the news with my lawyer. The auction date was set for the following month. She hadn't told anyone yet, perhaps too ashamed or too hopeful that she could fix it in time. But it was too late. For most people, this would have been a moment for revenge, for showing up, for shouting, for making her feel the same pain she had caused. But I didn't want any of that. I wanted something quieter, cleaner, a balance. We prepared the purchase discreetly. I didn't attend the auction in person. Mr. Rahman handled everything through the trust. No one there knew who the buyer truly was. Within days, the documents were finalized. The title was transferred. The dream house was now mine. When I held the papers in my hands, I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when a storm finally ends. I looked at her name printed in fading ink beside the property address. It was strange how simple it looked. Just letters on paper. And yet, those letters carried years of betrayal, of blindness, of lessons learned the hardest way. I remember standing by the window that night, looking out at the stars. The same stars that once looked down on our farm, now looked down on this new, twisted piece of irony. My land had become her house. Her house had become my closure. I didn't want her destroyed. I just wanted her to understand what she had broken, and that every broken thing eventually finds a way to return. So I waited. I waited for the perfect time to deliver the truth, not through shouting, not through arguments, but through a letter. A letter that would arrive in her mailbox and tell her that the house she called her dream was now owned by the man she thought she had left behind. The night before sending it, I sat by the window with the documents spread before me. For a long time, I stared at them, thinking about everything that had led to this point. I thought about how I could have stopped her years ago, how I could have been stricter, less trusting. But then I realized something. Trust isn't a weakness. Betrayal is. She had broken my trust, but I had never broken my principles. That was my victory. The next morning, I signed the final paper, folded it neatly, and sealed it. The postman came by at noon, and I handed him the envelope. He didn't know what it carried, but I did. It carried years of silence, folded neatly between legal documents. And as he walked away, I felt something inside me unclench for the first time in months. The ache in my chest eased. I wasn't angry anymore. I was free. The opportunity had come and gone, and I had used it, not to destroy, but to reclaim. Not to humiliate, but to restore balance. I didn't just take back what was lost. I took back my peace. The day I decided to buy her house, the world felt strangely still. The morning sun came through my small window like a quiet witness, washing the table where the documents lay in pale light. I looked at them, not with excitement, but with a deep sense of completion. For months, I had gathered proof, arranged funds, and built the foundation for this single act. Now everything was ready. The bank transfer had cleared. The legal trust, the silent company under my name, had been verified by the government registrar. The auction date was confirmed. All that was left was a signature. It was strange how something as small as ink on paper could carry the weight of betrayal, justice, and a lifetime's worth of lessons. Mr. Rahman, my lawyer, met me at his office that morning. His desk was covered in papers, neat and precise. He was a man who never wasted words, and that day was no different. He greeted me with a quiet nod, gestured toward the document, and said, "This will close the circle." I picked up the pen slowly. My hands didn't shake, not from age, not from nerves. I had spent years steadying them through storms far worse than this. When I signed my name, I felt no victory, only a quiet return to balance. With that single act, the ownership of her dream house passed to me, legally, completely, without loopholes or deception. The irony was almost poetic. She had stolen from me through fraud and manipulation. I had taken back through patience and law. Mr. Rahman looked at me for a long moment after it was done. "Do you want her to know?" he asked. I told him not yet. Let the silence do the talking. Some truths are heavier when they arrive without warning. I walked out of his office and into the busy street. Cars honked, people hurried, life moved on, unaware that one man had just rewritten the ending to his own story. I walked slowly, each step lighter than the last. I didn't go to the house immediately. I wanted time to let the weight of the decision settle. Over the next few days, I kept my routine, as if nothing had changed. I still drank my tea on the porch, still walked to the market, still greeted the neighbors with the same calm smile. But beneath that calm, I carried a quiet satisfaction. I had done what needed to be done, without anger, without shouting, without shame. When I finally visited the house, it was early morning. The sky was still pink, and the town was just beginning to stir. I stood across the street, looking at it. The walls were freshly painted white, the garden trimmed, the air thick with the scent of roses. It looked beautiful, like a dream wrapped in sunlight. But I didn't see a house. I saw a mirror, a reflection of everything that had gone wrong between us. The greed, the pride, the distance. And now, that mirror was mine. I walked closer, my shoes crunching on the gravel path. For a moment, I felt like an outsider again, just as I had when I lost the farm. But then I remembered, this time, I wasn't the one being pushed out. I was the one standing in truth. I met the caretaker, a middle-aged man who had been maintaining the place. He didn't know who I was. I introduced myself as the new owner. He nodded politely and opened the gate for me. Inside, everything smelled of new paint and cold luxury. The furniture was minimal, expensive, and soulless. I walked from room to room, touching nothing, just observing. In one corner of the living room, I saw a photograph on the table, my daughter with her husband and children smiling proudly in front of the same house. For a moment, a wave of sadness passed through me. Not regret, just a deep, tired sadness. Love doesn't die when it's betrayed. It just changes shape. Mine had turned into distance. I picked up the photo, looked at it quietly, and then placed it back exactly where it was. Nothing in that house needed to be disturbed. Not yet. That afternoon, I returned to my room and sat in silence. I thought about what had brought me here. The betrayal, the planning, the execution. Most people would call it revenge. But to me, it was restoration. I hadn't taken anything she hadn't already taken first. I hadn't stolen her future. I had simply reclaimed my peace. Mr. Rahman called that evening to confirm that all documents had been recorded and approved by the authorities. Everything was official. My name was now on the deed. Her house, the one she had bought with my stolen farm money, belonged to me. The next morning, I sent the caretaker instructions to continue maintaining the property. I wanted no drama, no sudden changes. The eviction notice would come later, and it would come legally. I wanted her to understand every part of this, that no matter how clever one thinks they are, the truth always finds its way home. For the next few weeks, I kept the secret. She continued living there, unaware of the storm quietly moving beneath her. I would sometimes pass by, walking on the opposite sidewalk, watching the lights in her window. There was a strange calm in knowing what she didn't. One evening, I saw her through the window, hosting a dinner with friends. Laughter, music, clinking glasses, everything she had traded her conscience for. But I didn't feel anger. I just thought about how easily people can mistake comfort for success. She had comfort, yes. But success? Success is sleeping peacefully at night, knowing your hands are clean. Mine were. A few days later, I received a call from the bank confirming the full transfer of ownership funds. The house was paid for in full. No loans, no debts, no shared names. It was done. The circle had closed completely. That night, I went for a long walk by the river. The same river that once irrigated my farm now reflected the lights from the town above. I sat on a bench and thought about how life has a way of balancing things. It doesn't happen quickly or loudly, but when it does, it's precise, almost surgical. I had done nothing illegal, nothing cruel. Everything had been clean, patient, and inevitable. She had gambled with deceit. I had played with discipline. In the end, the difference was simple. She had acted from greed. I had acted from truth. When I returned home, I wrote in my journal, something I hadn't done in years. I wrote, "Justice is not revenge. It is peace wearing its sharpest face." The following week, I prepared the letter, the one that would tell her everything. It wasn't written in anger. It was factual, polite, almost businesslike. I thanked her for teaching me that love without respect is fragile. I informed her of the ownership transfer. I gave her the legal notice period to vacate. No insults, no emotions, just truth. Before sealing the envelope, I paused and looked at the photograph I had seen in her house, her smile frozen in pride. For a moment, I almost didn't send it. Some part of me still wanted to protect her, still wanted to be a father. But then I remembered the empty fields, the stolen farm, the silence of betrayal. So I sealed it. When the postman collected it the next morning, I stood by the door, watching him ride away on his bicycle. It was such an ordinary sight, yet it carried the most extraordinary weight. That letter wasn't just ink and paper. It was years of sacrifice speaking one final sentence. You cannot build happiness on someone else's ruin. For the first time in a long while, I felt peace, the kind that doesn't need witnesses, applause, or revenge. Just silence, truth, and a closed circle. The morning her notice was delivered, the sky was heavy with rain. The kind of rain that doesn't roar but lingers, slow, steady, soaking everything it touches. I sat by the window, tea growing cold beside me, waiting for the inevitable. Some truths don't need witnesses, but I wanted to feel that moment. After all the years of sweat and trust and betrayal, this was the hour when everything would finally come full circle. The postman's bicycle bell rang faintly from the street. He parked under her gate, shook the rain off his bag, and slipped the envelope into the brass slot. It was simple, unmarked except for her name and address. Inside was the notice, a short letter written in legal language, polite and absolute. It informed her that the property she called home was now owned by another. It gave her 30 days to vacate. It explained that every document was verified and binding. It was the same kind of notice I once received when my world was taken from me. Except this time, the ink was mine. I didn't go there. I didn't want to see her face when she opened it. But I could picture it. Confusion first, disbelief next, then the slow sinking of realization. The house that had made her feel powerful now stood on foundations of borrowed lies, and the man she thought she'd erased from her life had just become her landlord. The hours passed like a whisper that day. I imagined her pacing the rooms, calling the realtor, calling the lawyer, calling anyone who might undo what had already been done. But the papers were clean. Every clause airtight, every signature real. There was no mistake to fix. When the rain stopped, I went for a walk. The air smelled of wet soil, that old scent of memory and labor. It reminded me of the farm, the one she had sold without a word. Funny how the world cycles itself. The same earth that bore our harvests now watched our justice unfold. Later that evening, I heard from the caretaker. He had received her call. She had been crying, confused, asking if there was some misunderstanding. He told her the truth gently. The property had been sold weeks ago through an open auction. The buyer was a trust. The documents had already been processed. When she asked who owned the trust, he said he didn't know. That was true. He didn't. Only I and Mr. Rahman knew the name behind those papers. She must have sat down then, realizing that the house she flaunted, the one she had bragged about to her friends, was slipping away piece by piece. Pride built on deceit always collapses under its own weight. The following week, I received a letter. Short, shaky handwriting, smudged with tears. It was from her. She didn't accuse me. She didn't even apologize. She just asked one question. Was it you? I didn't reply. There was nothing to explain. The truth didn't need words anymore. It had already spoken through signatures and silence. As the weeks went by, her calls became fewer. I knew she was struggling to understand the magnitude of what had happened. For years, she had held power through lies, the illusion that she controlled everything. But real power doesn't come from deception. It comes from endurance. And I had endured long enough. The caretaker told me later that she had begun packing quietly. No noise, no public spectacle. Just quiet shame filling the hallways where laughter once echoed. She moved slowly, like someone walking through fog, touching things she once thought she'd own forever. I imagined her folding clothes, taking down paintings, wrapping dishes in newspaper. Each sound, each movement, a small reminder of what she had done. I didn't rejoice in it. There was no pleasure in watching someone drown in their own choices, but there was peace, deep, unshakable peace, in knowing that truth had found its way home. The eviction date came closer. I visited the property once, from afar. The windows were open, curtains fluttered weakly in the wind. The garden was still beautiful, but there were fewer flowers now. The roses looked tired, as if even they understood the change. A few neighbors recognized me and nodded silently. None asked questions. They had seen everything unfold from a distance. They knew what she had done to me, and now they knew what had come back to her. People often talk of karma, like it's some mystical force, but karma is just consequence with patience. When the final day arrived, she left. No arguments, no begging, no drama, just a single car packed with boxes, her children in the back seat. The caretaker said she didn't look back once. Perhaps she couldn't bear to. Perhaps she knew the moment she turned around, the weight of her actions would crush her completely. That evening, the caretaker called me to say the house was empty. He had locked the doors and handed the keys to my lawyer. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat in the quiet and listened to the sound of my own breathing. For the first time in years, it felt easy. A few days later, I went to see the house again. Not as a stranger, not as a visitor, but as its rightful owner. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was different now, still, quiet, heavy with absence. I walked through each room slowly, feeling the echo of everything that had happened, the laughter, the betrayal, the silence that followed. In the kitchen, I saw a glass left behind on the counter. It was half full, a small trace of someone who had once believed the world belonged to them. I didn't move it. I just stood there, looking at the faint smudge of fingerprints on the glass, and thought about how fragile pride really is. Upstairs, the master bedroom was empty, except for a single folded blanket on the bed. I sat down on the edge of it, feeling the quiet settle around me. I remembered the day she was born, the way her tiny fingers had wrapped around mine, the way I promised myself I'd always protect her. And I realized I had kept that promise, just not in the way I expected. Sometimes protection isn't shelter. Sometimes it's teaching the consequence of cruelty. I spent the rest of the afternoon walking through the house, touching the walls lightly, as if greeting an old memory. This was no victory parade. It was closure, the soft kind, the kind that doesn't roar or boast. Before leaving, I went to the balcony. From there, I could see the town, the river, and in the far distance, the faint outline of what once was my farm, the land she had sold without a thought. For a long while, I just stood there, the wind brushing against my face, the sun dipping behind the hills. It was beautiful, peaceful, and utterly silent. When I finally turned to leave, I locked the door gently, not to trap anything inside, but to release what needed to go. That night, I wrote in my journal again, "Revenge is noisy. Justice is quiet. Only one lasts." Days turned into weeks, and life began to feel lighter. I didn't check on her, didn't follow her new address, didn't ask mutual friends for updates. She had her path, I had mine. All I knew was that, for the first time in years, my nights were dreamless. There's a strange calm that comes when the story ends exactly where it was supposed to, not with shouting, not with apologies, but with stillness. And as the weeks rolled into months, I realized something else. I hadn't destroyed her. I had simply stepped out of the cage she built around me. I didn't need to prove she was wrong. I only needed to prove I was still standing. She had taken my land. I had taken my silence. And silence, I discovered, is worth far more than any field, any house, any inheritance. It's the sound of peace after pain. When the notice became public record, the story spread like wildfire through the small town. People talked. They always do. They whispered in grocery lines, murmured in markets, exchanged glances outside the church. Every tongue repeated the same sentence in different tones. She sold her father's farm and lost her own house. I didn't start the story. I didn't need to. Truth has a way of walking on its own feet. At first, I ignored the noise. I didn't want gossip. I wanted peace. But it was impossible to live in a place where silence carried louder than sound. Wherever I went, eyes followed me, not with pity this time, but with something heavier, respect. The kind of respect born not from power, but from quiet endurance. Elias, my old neighbor, came to see me one afternoon. He brought bread and tea, sat quietly for a while before speaking. "The town's talking," he said softly. "They know what she did. And they know you didn't raise your hand, only your head." I nodded. That was enough. I had spent too long explaining myself to people who never listened. Now, I didn't have to say a word. Across town, her life was unraveling in silence. She had moved into a rented apartment, far smaller than the house she lost. Her friends, the same ones who had once praised her ambition, stopped visiting. In a place where pride is currency, her account had run dry. She walked through markets with lowered eyes, and even the air around her seemed to shrink. I never celebrated her fall. I wasn't built for cruelty, but I also didn't intervene. Pain teaches what love sometimes cannot. One morning, I received a call from her oldest friend, Miriam. Her voice trembled. "She's not doing well," she said. "She cries a lot. She doesn't eat." I listened in silence. Then I said something I never thought I'd say. "Neither did I, when she sold the land that fed us all." The line went quiet. There was nothing more to add. A few days later, I saw her by chance. I was walking through the market when she appeared at the far end of the street. For a moment, our eyes met. Time froze. The noise of vendors, the clatter of carts, the hum of voices, all vanished into stillness. She didn't walk toward me. She didn't speak. She just looked, long enough for me to see the regret sitting behind her tired eyes. In that instant, I understood something profound. I had spent months planning the perfect lesson, crafting the perfect silence. But remorse, real remorse, doesn't come from punishment. It comes from recognition, and I could see it now in her. That was enough. When she turned and walked away, I didn't stop her. The story didn't need another scene. It had already written its ending. Weeks turned into months, and the whispers began to fade. The town moved on to newer scandals, fresher gossip. But one thing stayed constant. People treated me differently now. Not out of fear or guilt, but out of quiet regard. Men nodded as I passed. Women offered tea without hesitation. They saw not a victim, but a man who had endured the unimaginable and still carried himself with grace. One evening, Elias visited again. "Do you feel lighter now?" he asked. I smiled faintly. "No," I said, "not lighter. Just balanced." He nodded, understanding without needing more words. Balance. That was the only thing I ever wanted. Not revenge, not riches, not recognition. just balance. For every seed I had planted in honesty, a harvest of truth. For every betrayal, a moment of peace. The local newspaper wrote a small column about the property dispute. It didn't name names, but everyone knew. The writer described it as a rare case of justice delivered without bitterness. I kept that clipping, not as proof, but as a reminder that dignity, once reclaimed, becomes its own monument. Meanwhile, she continued living quietly on the other side of town. Occasionally, I heard bits and pieces, that she had found part-time work, that her children were adjusting, that she no longer spoke of luxury. Sometimes I wondered if she thought of the farm, if she remembered the smell of the soil after rain, the way I used to lift her onto the tractor when she was little. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. But I had stopped needing the answer. Some wounds don't close with apologies. They close with distance. One Sunday, nearly half a year after it all ended, I visited the countryside again. The farm was under new ownership, but the fields still looked familiar, green, endless, alive. I stood at the edge of the fence, breathing in the scent of wet grass, listening to the hum of insects. The land didn't hate me for leaving. It didn't mourn for her either. Land doesn't take sides. It only remembers who worked it with love. I whispered a silent goodbye, not to the place, but to the man I used to be, the one who believed love alone could shield against betrayal. He was gone now. In his place stood a man who had learned that respect must be guarded, not given blindly. The next day, I went back to the town office and signed a few final papers, transferring a small amount of my savings to a local school. The note read, "For children who still believe in loyalty." The clerk smiled when she read it, but didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. In the months that followed, I began rebuilding my days quietly. Early walks, simple meals, conversations that didn't cut. I found small joy in ordinary things. The sound of rain on the roof, the sight of birds at dawn. The kind of joy that can only live in a heart emptied of noise. Every now and then, people asked if I'd ever speak to her again. I never gave a clear answer. Some things don't belong to time. They belong to silence. She knew where to find me. If she ever came, I would not turn her away. But I would not chase her either. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I sat on my porch and wrote in my journal again. "Peace," I wrote, "is not the absence of others. It is the presence of yourself." And for the first time in years, I felt entirely present. The world outside continued to move. Crops grew, seasons shifted, people aged. But inside, I was still. The house she once called hers had become a place of quiet reflection. I didn't decorate it, didn't change much. It remained simple. White walls, wooden floors, the faint echo of lessons learned. Sometimes I walked through it at night, letting my footsteps echo softly through the halls. Every sound reminded me that peace doesn't need noise to exist. It just needs truth. As time went on, I realized something else. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering without hate. I hadn't forgotten what she did. I never would. But the bitterness was gone. It had dissolved into something far more valuable: understanding. I understood that she wasn't evil, just lost. Lost in the illusion that wealth equals worth, that power equals freedom. But freedom, I learned, comes only when your conscience sleeps without chains. In the quiet years that followed, I found myself visiting the small chapel near the market every Sunday. I didn't pray for miracles. I prayed for clarity, for her, for myself, for the generations that would come after us. I prayed that they would learn from our story without having to live it. The priest, a gentle man with kind eyes, once asked me, "Do you regret teaching her the lesson this way?" I thought for a long time before answering. "No," I said softly, "because words would have been forgotten. This will stay with her forever." He nodded, as if understanding that some lessons must be written in consequence, not conversation. The fallout wasn't a storm. It was a quiet settling of dust. Everything that was meant to crumble did. Everything that was meant to stand remained. She learned what loss feels like. I learned what peace feels like, and in that balance, something divine existed. Not punishment, but restoration. So when people ask me what really happened between us, I simply said, life happened. Because life, at its core, is the slow art of learning what truly matters. She lost a house. I lost a daughter. But we both found something deeper, truth. And truth, once found, doesn't need forgiveness to heal. It simply exists, clean and unbroken. The day I decided to leave, the sun rose slow and golden, the kind of morning that makes everything look softer than it really is. I stood by the window, with my old suitcase on the table, the same one I had packed when I left the farm years ago. It was worn, scratched, the leather faded from age, but still strong, just like me. I didn't pack much this time. A few shirts, a pair of boots, my journal, and the photograph of my wife holding our daughter as a child. Everything else, I left behind. There was nothing bitter about my leaving. The air didn't taste like victory. It tasted like closure, that quiet, invisible flavor of something finished, of a circle complete. The house stood behind me in perfect stillness. I had walked through every room one last time the night before, touching the walls lightly as if to say goodbye. Each space held its own ghost, laughter, pain, betrayal, silence. I had faced them all, forgiven none, but carried no hate either. I left a small note for the caretaker on the table, thanking him for his service, and a little envelope with his final payment. He had served faithfully through the storm, and I wanted his chapter to end cleanly too. When I stepped outside, the early air wrapped around me like a blessing. I walked down the gravel path that led to the main road. The sound of my boots against the stones echoed softly, steady, final. The roses by the gate were blooming again. I stopped and looked at them, remembering how she used to pluck them as a child, running around with red petals in her hands, calling them tiny suns. Time had turned those suns cold, but they were still beautiful, still alive. I took one last deep breath, filled my lungs with the scent of earth and memory, and kept walking. The bus stop was nearly empty. Just an old man reading a newspaper and a young boy kicking stones. I sat on the bench, suitcase beside me, and looked at the horizon. For the first time in many years, I had no destination heavy on my mind. I wasn't running, and I wasn't chasing. I was simply moving forward. The bus arrived with a low hiss, brakes sighing against the road. I climbed aboard and found a seat by the window. As the engine started and the town began to roll away behind me, I didn't look back. I had learned something over the years. People who keep looking back never really leave. The road curved past the river, the one that had reflected my peace the day I signed the papers. It shimmered under the sunlight, the same calm surface that had watched generations of my family live, fight, love, and drift apart. The water didn't judge, it only moved. And maybe that's what I was doing now, flowing where peace lived, leaving behind everything that made my soul heavy. The bus rattled through small villages, past green fields and old temples. Children waved at the windows, laughing, their joy light and unburdened. Watching them, I felt a quiet ache, not of regret, but of memory. Childhood has a way of reminding you what you once believed the world could be. After a few hours, the road began to climb toward the hills. I had chosen this route deliberately, to a small town I remembered visiting with my wife when we were young. It wasn't far, but far enough to be forgotten. I wanted that anonymity, to live as a man, not as a story. When the bus finally stopped, I stepped off into clean, mountain air. The sky was wide, the streets narrow, and the people kind. It was the kind of place where no one asked questions unless you wanted them to. I found a small inn by the roadside, white walls, wooden railings, flowers hanging from the balcony. The owner, a gentle woman with silver hair, welcomed me with a soft smile. She didn't recognize me. Good. I rented a small room with a view of the hills. That first night, I sat by the window watching the mist roll over the trees. I wrote in my journal for hours. Not about revenge or betrayal, but about stillness. How silence could be both weapon and healing. How dignity, once reclaimed, needed to be guarded, not paraded. Days turned into weeks, and life began to move differently here. I woke with the sun, walked to the market, and returned by noon. In the evenings, I read old books and watched the sky change colors. I didn't talk much, but when people greeted me, I smiled back. There was comfort in being just another old man, unnoticed and free. Sometimes, I walked to the nearby river and watched farmers work the land. Their movements reminded me of my younger years, bending, sowing, trusting the soil without question. The sound of shovels hitting earth, the rustle of wind in the crops. It all blended into a melody I had once lived by. I closed my eyes and listened, knowing that even though my farm was gone, the rhythm of that life still pulsed inside me. I never tried to rebuild what I had lost. Some things aren't meant to be rebuilt. They're meant to rest, like chapters closed gently instead of ripped apart. Once, I received a letter. The handwriting was familiar, her handwriting. My daughter. The envelope was small, plain, with no return address. I held it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single page. The words were short, almost hesitant. I understand now. I see what I did. I'm sorry. No explanations, no excuses, just those simple lines. I folded the letter and placed it in my journal between the pages of the day I first bought her house. Not to preserve her apology, but to keep the story whole, from betrayal to balance, from noise to quiet. I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, because some silences are answers strong enough to last a lifetime. The months slipped by gently. The seasons changed, and I changed with them. My hair grew whiter, my steps slower, but my heart lighter. There's a strange sweetness in solitude when it isn't loneliness. It's like drinking clear water after years of bitterness. One evening, as I sat by the riverbank, the sky turned crimson with sunset. The reflection in the water looked almost like the flames of a slow-burning fire, not destruction, but transformation. And I realized that's what this journey had been. Not revenge, not punishment, transformation. I had taken pain and turned it into purpose, betrayal and turned it into wisdom, distance and turned it into peace. Sometimes people think strength is loud, fists, shouting, breaking things. But I had learned the opposite. Real strength is quiet. It's the ability to walk away without leaving pieces of yourself behind. That night, I wrote in my journal one final time. She sold my farm. I bought her dream. But in the end, I didn't win. I just stopped losing. Then I closed the book, placed it on the shelf, and turned off the light. The room filled with soft moonlight, silver and still. I lay down and listened to the night, the crickets, the wind, the heartbeat of the earth. And for the first time in a long time, sleep came easily. I didn't dream of her, or the farm, or the house. I dreamed of nothing, and it was beautiful. Now, as I sit by the window of my small cottage, the air quiet and kind, I often think about everything that happened. The land, the betrayal, the silence, and the peace that followed. I am not a bitter man. I've seen enough seasons to know that bitterness poisons the soil that could still grow flowers. But I am not a forgetful man either. Every scar life leaves behind is a seed of wisdom if you let it bloom the right way. When I look back, I realize my story was never really about revenge. It was about reclaiming dignity. People mistake the two. Revenge is when you want to make someone hurt. Dignity is when you stop allowing them to. I didn't ruin her life. I only stopped letting her use mine as her foundation. That's the difference between anger and self-respect. Sometimes I walk to the edge of the hill where the sun rises early and the air smells like wet grass. I stand there and let the wind pass through me. The world looks small from here, the kind of small that makes your problems feel measured. I think about the farm I once owned, how every inch of soil carried my sweat, how every seed carried my hope. And then I think about the house she lost, the one I bought quietly, not to destroy her, but to teach her what happens when trust is sold. Trust is not a loan. It doesn't renew. Once you spend it, it's gone. For years, I believed love was enough to protect a family. That if you gave everything, Time, money, affection, forgiveness, they would understand your worth. But I learned something hard and unshakable. Love without respect is slavery. When you love someone who doesn't see your value, you are teaching them to forget your worth. I used to think being quiet made me weak. I thought silence was surrender. But silence is only weakness when it hides fear. When silence holds truth, it becomes strength. Every decision I made, every paper I signed, every calm step I took was rooted in that silence. The world doesn't need to hear your pain to make it real. You only need to act in alignment with it. I never shouted at her, never cursed her name. I didn't destroy her reputation. I just let the truth breathe, and it did what it always does. It found its way out. There were nights after everything ended when I'd sit outside under the stars and wonder if I had gone too far. I'd imagine her face, her tears, her disbelief. But each time I asked myself that question, the same memory answered it. The day I came home to find my land gone, my history erased, and my trust traded for greed. That memory carried no malice. It carried clarity. She took something sacred, something I built with my hands, and sold it like a trinket. But the worst part wasn't the sale. It was the belief that I wouldn't notice, that I was too old, too slow, too kind to fight back. That's the mistake people make with age. They think years make you softer. What they don't understand is that years make you sharper. You just stop wasting your blade on noise. Now, as an old man, I see things differently. We live in a world that confuses kindness for weakness. But true kindness is control. It's power without cruelty. It's the ability to burn someone down, but choosing not to. I could have destroyed her life completely. I had the resources, the proof, the right. But I didn't. I gave her back what she gave me. Distance. And that was enough. Because peace, once found, is the most expensive thing in this world. Sometimes I see fathers like me, sitting quietly in parks or in cafes, their hands trembling a little, their eyes distant. I wonder how many of them are carrying untold stories of betrayal, neglect, disrespect. I want to tell them this. Don't waste your last years proving your pain. Prove your strength by walking away from it. Let them talk. Let them lie. Let them believe you're done. The world has its way of coming full circle. And when it does, you'll be standing in the exact same spot, but lighter, freer, cleaner. The world forgets, but the soul doesn't. The universe keeps receipts. I think often of my wife. She would have handled all this differently, maybe with more emotion, more confrontation. She had a fire I never had. But even she would have understood the ending. She used to say, "What you let go of defines what you gain." I didn't understand it then. I do now. I let go of my daughter, and in doing so, I found myself again. Do I miss her? Yes. Every day. There's an ache that never leaves, the kind that doesn't hurt anymore, but never stops existing either. It's like a soft shadow following you wherever you go. But I've learned to walk with it instead of fighting it. Sometimes, when I pass children in the market calling to their parents, I feel a pang in my chest, a memory, not a wound. I hope those parents never know what it feels like to be betrayed by your own blood. I hope those children never learn the price of their parents' sacrifices through punishment. But life doesn't always grant those wishes. The older I get, the more I realize we don't own people, not even our children. We raise them, love them, teach them, but in the end, they belong to the world. And the world, cruel or kind, will teach them what we couldn't. When I bought her house, I didn't want revenge. I wanted balance. Revenge feeds the ego. Balance feeds the soul. I wanted her to feel the weight of her actions, not to break her, but to ground her. And maybe one day she'll understand that. Now, I live simply. My days are slow, my meals humble, my nights quiet. I tend to a small garden behind the cottage. It's not much. Just a few rows of vegetables, a patch of herbs, and 2 rose bushes. Every morning, I water them before the sun gets too strong. And every time I do, I'm reminded that life always finds a way to grow again, no matter how many times it's been cut down. Growth isn't loud, it's quiet, like forgiveness. Sometimes, when the sun sets, I sit on the porch and look at the sky turning gold and pink. The hills glow softly, and for a moment, everything feels right. I close my eyes and let the wind carry the sound of the world. In that stillness, I understand what peace really means. It's not forgetting the past, it's making peace with it. I think about the people who will hear this story. Maybe some will see revenge, maybe others will see justice. But I hope they see the truth, that no matter how cruel the betrayal, the best answer is dignity. Always dignity. You can rebuild money, rebuild homes, even rebuild reputations. But once you lose your dignity, nothing you build stands tall. I refused to let mine fall, even when the person breaking it was my own blood. In the end, I did what every man must do when his heart is broken by his own. I stopped waiting for an apology and became my own peace. Now I am old, but not empty. Alone, but not lonely. Quiet, but not defeated. I have learned that the loudest revenge is silence, and the deepest justice is truth. I close my eyes sometimes and whisper to the wind, "She sold my farm. I bought her dream." It sounds harsh, but it isn't. It's balance, like sunrise after storm, like still water after flood. If you're listening to this, wherever you are, remember this lesson from an old man. Don't chase revenge. Don't beg for love. Don't let betrayal turn you bitter. Turn it into wisdom. Let the world think you've lost, and then quietly rebuild yourself where no one can reach. Because when you rise in silence, no one can take credit for your strength. And when you finally find peace, it doesn't roar, it whispers, just like I do now.